Hello, and welcome to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Let's unpack the relationships that we encounter in our daily lives and learn about what makes them tick. And now your host for Red Rock Relationships, Dr. James B. Stein.
Well, we are back after a substantial hiatus. In truth, we were supposed to have an episode a couple weeks ago in between our last episode and this episode, but, sometimes stuff gets in the way. So, today, we are doing double duty. We got 2 episodes back to back, super excited about it. And the first one that we're doing is actually going to build off of the last episode that we did with our next guest. So more on that later, but first, we got to talk about the topic of the hour. Today we will be expanding our knowledge about the role that culture plays in relationship formation, and to help me do that, I have brought back yet another Arizona State professor, Dr. Sarah Amira de la Garza. Thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly the pleasure is ours. So we're going to definitely get into how cultural membership and co-cultural membership can alter the ways in which we engage in and maintain our existing close relationships. But before we do that, whenever we have a new guest, we've got to hear a little bit about that guest. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us maybe the elevator talk about like who you are, what your scholastic lineage is, and what you study now.
Well, I'm an associate professor and Southwest Borderlands scholar at Arizona State University, and what I work in is a combination of performance studies and the study of culture and creative methodology. So my way of looking at communication is to attempt to find ways that scholarship can be done through research and then can be presented for the general public in artistic and performative, creative ways that can reach people who perhaps aren't academics. And I'm really interested in my own work in the kinds of things that prevent people from speaking their heart, speaking their mind, even when they feel real conviction. And I think that's connected to my early work was many years ago was just looking at why patients wouldn't tell doctors what they needed to tell them about their health because they were afraid to offend the doctor or something. And it's just always fascinated me how people can know so well what they think and feel, but when the opportunity to speak up comes up, they often are silent.
Yeah, you have unintentionally previewed an episode from our next season in the fall of 2022. We're going to be talking about patient-provider relations with a faculty member here at my university, actually. But that is a fascinating area of research, and perhaps even more fascinating than that is the effort and focus that you've placed on delineating this information to groups that would, as you said, otherwise not be able to access it. That's part of what this podcast is all about. So hopefully you'll find a good home here. Are you ready to get into it and talk a little bit about some of the more detailed elements of culture in relationships?
Absolutely.
Awesome. So we actually had, way back in season 1, Dr. Tara Sunya Tichaiporn came on and talked about the very most basics of intercultural relationships. We talked about things like self-construals and how our own construal can interact with society and how this helps modulate the ways in which we form and maintain relationships. And like I said, she'll be on after this episode, but that was really we really only got to scratch the surface there. So my first question to you is, what other ways can cultures distinguish themselves or vary, or in what other ways do cultures tend to emerge through human communication?
Well, I often tell people that culture is the is a systematic way that we continue to make meaning and to maintain meaning. So basically, through the way we talk and the way we act, we demonstrate what we think is happening and what we think things mean. And we also try to maintain the way that we frame things, which is what makes it so hard when people from different cultures come together, because this impulse to maintain our view of the world basically comes head to head with perhaps another way of looking at the world. And it is connected to how we view ourselves, how we view our friends, how we view our work. So when you begin to alter some of these elements, you could have kind of like a little domino effect, and multiple aspects of your life can begin to change. And so I think that, from a tribal perspective, it's a really good thing that people were so protective. But now that we live in such a transcultural global society, the idea of having so much defensive-ness around keeping only one way of looking at the world is really not very effective or efficient. So I think it's useful to know about the ways that culture varies, so that when you encounter the differences, you're not completely caught off guard. One of those things could be like they talk about. I think you said you've mentioned individualism and collectivism in the past, so that some people are focused on themselves or individuals, and others are focused on what the group is doing and a group identity. Well, another way that cultures vary is through formality, and they used to call this power distance. And basically it means that in some cultures there's a heavy emphasis put on giving a lot of distance and reverence and respect to people with status or position, tradition, and then in other cultures that's not as important. So in the United States, in general, we tend to not be a high power distance culture where we'd like to think that we're all equal. However, if you go to a formal dinner, immediately you find that there are contexts where we wait and we want to know what that person is going to say, and you try not to speak when they're speaking because they're the most important. That's power distance. But you can go into other societies where that high power distance is in every setting, and an American very often will disrupt norms because we treat everybody as if they're our pal, and they're not accustomed to that.
You know what? Speaking of dinner and food, because it's something that food is one of my most cathartic things. I think about slurping and how I was fortunate enough to grow up with a best friend who is Vietnamese. And when I would eat at his house, slurping was encouraged, right? And for many cultures, it's a sign that you're enjoying the food. If you do that at a fancy restaurant here in the States, you might get some weird looks. But if you don't do that at a fancy restaurant in some other countries, you might get some weird looks. And so I think that's one really interesting way in which those subtle little behaviors vary so dramatically based on culture. Now, speaking of the ways in which our various definitions can be changed, when we think about relationships, the word relationships here in the States, when I teach my class on close relationships, the knee-jerk reaction tends to be a traditional heterosexual relationship, a dating relationship or a marriage relationship. I'm wondering if that word relationship has different meanings or can take on new meanings across different cultures or in different cultural contexts.
Definitely. And I think even using the word relationship is a sort of an innovation that evolved perhaps with the study of psychology and our study of interpersonal relationships, whereas there were a lot of taken for granted traditional approaches that reflected the way that power had been created in societies in the past. And now, as people learn about new opportunities, new places, new aspects of themselves, even as they allow themselves to be more flexible, the word actually seems to encompass any kind of encounter we have with someone that is helping us to grow in intimacy to that which is different than us, as well as that which was unknown in ourselves. That's kind of the way that I tend to look at relationships, is that they're never really about two people, but they're really about all the multiple ways in which we've been in the past and the way that other people have been. And the relationship is stronger if more of those aspects of yourself can be comfortably present with the other. And a traditional relationship usually had one dimension that was stressed, and then those were maintained all the time. And if you deviated, then there was something wrong with the relationship. I think we're needing to move in a direction where we start to realize that what a guy by the name of Kenneth Gergen said, that recognize that we're all multiphrenic instead of schizophrenic. We're multiphrenic. We have a lot of different versions of ourselves. And when you're truly intimate with someone, they're comfortable with many of those aspects of who you are.
I love that. You know what that makes me think of? And I may be misconceptualizing this. Your colleague, Sarah Tracy, and her conceptualization of the crystallized self, the idea that we are constantly reflecting and refracting different elements of our identity based on our surroundings and based on sometimes something as simple as our state of mind or our mood. Is that somewhere similar to all of that?
I think so. I think that what it calls for in relationship, though, because I think the crystallized self is still emphasizing self. In relationship, many years before, I had a student who actually did a study of Borderlands identity, and also came up with that model of a crystallized Borderlands identity, which means that there's many facets to our identity, and in a relationship, let's look at this. There's situations where people are talking with the friends of their partner, and when they hear the friends talking to the partner, they act surprised because they didn't realize their partner was that way. Right. That's when the facets are not being shared within the intimacy of the relationship, and I think that it's just like with a stone. When you actually have a faceted stone, if you can realize that the beauty of the stone is when you move it around and you can see all those different facets. So in many ways, the relationship over time should become more appreciative of the gem-like quality of the person that you're with, because you're making them fuller rather than less than.
Oh, that's very interesting. I like that. I quite like that analogy. So short answer, yes. Our understanding of relationships can and do differ. Here's the question that I've really been wanting to ask. And I'm going to just use one example here. A lot of cultures, and the example that I'm going to use here is religion. Where I'm from on the East Coast, it tends to occur a little bit more with Orthodox Jewish families. In the area of the country that I'm currently in, it tends to occur a little bit more with LDS families, and of course, other denominations practice this as well. But there are some cultural pockets, such as religion, in which they encourage things like interfaith marriage or discourage dating outside of like the cultural nest. And my question about that is, are there benefits to that sort of like relational hoarding where we're only allowing our community members to date in and amongst themselves? Are there benefits to that, and are there drawbacks to that? And if so, what do those look like?
Well, the benefits oftentimes are cultural in the sense that by having in-group relationships emphasized, particularly as you're creating family units and continuing the group, you're perpetuating the culture and you create a stability. And in that, you can actually see that these practices have allowed groups like the Jewish culture to perpetuate itself despite the many attempts politically and historically to eliminate them. So by focusing on these relationships and the practices and traditions that go along with the culture, you actually can perpetuate the stability of the cultural group. Other ways in family communication research, they've often found in past research that people reported satisfaction when they were in these relationships that had similarity. And usually it's because there's a lot of predictability and familiarity and an assumption that there's going to be less conflict because they agree on these things. However, there's also the perspective that when we hear that opposites attract, it's not just the attraction as much as the fact that when you are with somebody that is different than you, you actually have the possibility of growing beyond that which you have been in the past. And there are those who've actually some psychologists who did some work with deep qualitative sessions with couples and found that the most satisfaction was with people who were opposites. However, the fact that they were more satisfied doesn't mean it was easier. It means that they had the possibility to encounter things that were unexpected for them. And so they're in their relationship, they continue to grow continually. And so their satisfaction is really, really deep versus a satisfaction that comes out of a comfort of not being surprised, which I think is what you find when people are very similar and predictable from day to day.
Yeah, that makes me think of relational dialectics theory, the original relational dialectics theory, and this strain between predictability and novelty of, I want someone who's reliable and static, who I can depend on, and at the same time, I want something unique and different. I want to expand my horizons. And so I think what really struck me about your answer is the way that you explained the lack of ease and painted it as a good thing, like the growth necessary to be with someone who's maybe not opposite from you, but maybe someone who complements you, like somebody who offers areas of experience and knowledge and depth where you simply don't. And so I think if we limit ourselves only to exploring those people whose ideologies are identical to ours, we risk losing that sort of important growth. I don't know. What do you think?
I think I agree. I think that sometimes the reason that we say that opposites attract, from some psychological views, it's that you are actually identifying in the other something that you're perhaps still a little uncomfortable with knowing in yourself. And so you're happy to be with this other person because it brings that out in you. And so sometimes even in breakups, when someone has been very different from you, part of the grief is losing that aspect of yourself that you had because you were with somebody that was different. And I think that by having relationships with people who are very different from us, we become more flexible. I believe we become possibly more able to be resilient because we see the capacity to alter how we are in order to survive and move on when situations change.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. I think that's a really important point, and it guides us naturally into the last thing that I wanted to discuss, which is if we do find ourselves in a position where we are in a close relationship, be it romantic, sexual, or otherwise, if we're in a close relationship with somebody who was raised in a different cultural background, what might be some ways that we, the out-group member, can connect with that part of their identity? Big important caveat here, without overstepping, without appropriating, or without, engaging in like the sort of elder speak that you might do when someone is different from you.
It's actually very simple to explain, very difficult to enact. And the simplicity is that generally we basically just have to be sincerely interested in learning. And so oftentimes, when we care a lot about somebody, we might feel a little insecure. And so we put too much effort into trying to perform difference, which can sometimes feel offensive and uncomfortable to someone who feels objectified. However, having a sincere interest in learning new ways is a way to build intimacy. And I think that the way to make ourselves better at that in our personal relationships is to try to develop a general openness in our lives, so that the only place that we're being open-minded isn't in our relationship. Therefore, we don't act surprised when difference arises in our partners. There's also kind of like this reaction. I often have students do an exercise that's called weird, strange, or WTF. And basically they begin to notice that when they see something different, how their mind automatically will say it's rude. Oh, that's rude. Oh, that's weird. Or what the, when they see something different. And that's the first lesson in an intercultural class that I start with, which is how can we slow our reaction time down so that when we hear or experience something different, rather than immediately pushing it away because of difference, we say, I'd like to learn about that. Could you tell me more about that? Or, where did that come from? And so having that interest and then remembering what you've learned, so that it's not just a token interest,
right.
Remembering it so that in future situations, you actually introduce elements of what you learned from your partner into your daily life. That way it's a natural growing together rather than a lot of token efforts.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I especially like the way that you qualified that by talking about how it's more than just doing this at the relational level. If you're dating someone from a different culture, it's more than just saying, I like you and I want to learn about your culture, and almost like adapting the mentality of like, I find this interesting and I want to learn more about this. And I think that promotes a level of like almost interpersonal intersectionality where you are allowing yourself to grow rather than viewing yourself as like an outsider who's just adjusting their behavior to meet the needs of this other person in your life. And so it's avoiding that othering complex that a lot of folks go through.
Your relationship is not a museum.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, that is absolutely right on the nose. I don't think I could have said it any better. So we have 2 minutes left. During that time, I'm curious to see if you have an opinion on this idea of like kind of coming back to what you were talking about with like the strange, weird WTF and the whole othering complexity. How can we catch ourselves? And this is mostly like a question for white people. How can we catch ourselves doing this othering when we're around people who engage in practices that we might not be familiar with? What's a step that we can take to work around that?
Well, just a very simple thing it started with a mentoring of a student I did years ago. And basically I said, take a little notebook with you wherever you go. And every time that you notice yourself saying, oh, that's weird, oh, that was rude, or just write it down. Write down what it was and notice how many times you do it. It's really incredibly overwhelming when you realize how many times you do it in a day. But if you do that practice for just a number of days, your self-awareness gets heightened so much that you actually begin to withhold it. I think what happens is that we're so unconscious of how easily we do that if you build the consciousness of it, that alone will begin to help us in our efforts to stop doing it.
That's a very active technique too, and it makes me think of in our research methods class we just finished going over qualitative methods. It makes me think of like the practice of doing field notes and transcription, where you're challenging yourself to observe yourself and critique yourself, which is something that a lot of people struggle with in a lot of different ways. Anyway,
well, a relationship's a good place to start.
Absolutely, 100%. So that's going to, bring us to the end of our time today. Dr. Sarah Amira de la Garza, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and sharing this unique and informative perception and perspective, rather, on relational functioning. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it was my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. And of course, we got another episode coming right on after this one. Dr. Tara Suwinyatichai-Porn. She's going to come on and talk about sexual confidence. But for now, it's halftime, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back with another awesome episode. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to Red Rock Relationships, a podcast about communication. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time. If you'd like to be on the show or have questions for us, please send us an email to redrockrelationships@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search Red Rock Relationships. Thank you again. And remember, it all begins with good communication. This has been a production from a podcast studio.